Thank you, Kristen, for that introduction. And good morning, everyone. My name is Richard Grochon, and as Kristen said, Matt and I will make a presentation. This is the final presentation by our working group, so it might be a bit more lengthy than the other presentations for that reason. On the first slide, you can see the title of the group. It's quite lengthy: Large-Scale Circulation Patterns Associated with North American Short-Term Temperature and Precipitation Extreme Events, or otherwise known as the Extremes Working Group. And here's a listing of the members of that working group, and Matt and I would like to acknowledge and thank these people for their efforts to make this a successful working group effort. The main activities of the working group are summarized on this slide. There were 7 basic things that we did, and I'll go through these fairly quickly, and then we'll get to the recommendations and spend more time talking about those in detail. A little bit of jargon first. We'll use the acronym LSMP to stand for Large-Scale Meteorological Patterns. These are synoptic patterns in terms of their time scale, relatively short. They tend to be equivalent barotropic in structure, and as implied by the name, they are large in scale, covering an ocean basin wide or even continental scale. They differ from low-frequency modes, and we'll say more about that. Here's a couple of illustrations, actually 3. So the top row are for cold air outbreaks affecting California, and the areas that are in blue are unusually low values, the areas that are yellow unusually high values. And the middle row is for 500 millibar height anomalies. So areas that are red are positive, areas of blue are negative, and unusually so. And so again, with that you can see this pattern that spans the Pacific Ocean, so that's what we mean by large scale. The bottom row is for frontal associated extreme precipitation affecting California. About 2 years ago almost now, we had a successful workshop. It also had a lengthy title. You'll see why in a moment. The participants are pictured there. And we tried to bring together experts from 4 different areas: data, extreme value statistics, synoptics and dynamics, and modeling. And the workshop was organized with formal talks, and then we had breakout sessions on each of these 4 areas, and then people came back and reported, and we discussed them further in a large meeting hall. One of the things that came out of that was a special issue of Variations about a year ago, and probably the primary thing, or the most important thing that came out of that, was a lengthy workshop report, again about a year ago. This summarizes our present state of knowledge and methodologies having to do with data and the needs for extreme events being somewhat different than your typical data needs. Extreme value statistics and their applications, also things like how you identify LSMPs in data. We have some summary of the synoptic dynamics and then some modeling approaches. We make detailed recommendations on data, statistical tools, synoptic dynamics, knowledge gaps, modeling needs, and a few other general recommendations in that report. And most of our presentation today will be on this set of recommendations. Matt and I contributed to Section 5.2 in the U.S. CLIVAR Science Plan. This section is one that describes 4 research challenges, and one of those research challenges has to do with extremes. So the sub-areas that are in that Section 5.2 are listed there. And we note that there have been prior working groups on droughts and hurricanes, and we basically were the first group to touch upon precipitation and temperature, as best I know, at least in terms of heavy precipitation. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. We also contributed a little bit to the CMIP 6 planning. A primary issue for us who are working on extremes is to have data that has sufficiently high resolution. Of particular need is time resolution, so something on the order of less than 6 hours or equal to 6 hours would be useful. Certainly not monthly mean data, that doesn't help us. Vertical resolution can also be important as well to resolve some of the structures. We're very pleased to announce the publication of a lengthy paper in climate dynamics. This has taken about 2 years for us to put this together. Basically, it was first, what do I want to say? The information that went into it was first prompted by that August 2013 workshop, and of course we developed further beyond that. The paper is 34 pages in the journal, so it's quite lengthy, but one does not need to read the entire paper. One can skip to whatever section is of interest. And the topics are divided into sections, and they're listed there, the 5 main ones. So under data issues, we talk about the things needed for extreme events identification and so forth. We also talk a bit about extreme value statistics there. Under methodologies, we summarize a half-dozen ways in which one could find LSMPs, both the pros and the cons. We summarize synoptic dynamic knowledge of these where it's available. And we focus on also section 4 on model simulation of these temperature extremes. And then finally a bit on the trends. So we're thankful that US CLIVAR funded this as an open access article. It will be quite popular, and if you haven't heard of it, it's because it only appeared last Friday. So look for it on a newsstand near you, I guess. And now I'd like to turn it over to Matt to summarize the next 3 slides.
All right, folks, I hope you can hear me. We also have a precipitation extremes survey paper running essentially parallel to the temperature one, but not as far along. So at the moment, we have a first draft of all the sections, roughly paralleling, you can see on the slide, I think, roughly paralleling the temperature paper, but precipitation. So data and extreme event identification, types of extreme events, synoptics, remote influence, trend detection, and simulation of the extreme events and their large-scale meteorological patterns. So we have a first draft of that, and that's churning along as well. And I think at least what we have so far is, I think, adequately or hopefully adequately represented in the summary that we're presenting to you here. So I'm just going to give you, unfortunately, I apologize for the wordiness of this slide. So this is a sort of a big picture view of the findings of the working group, and then we'll break that down into probably more detail than you want. So 4 points. One is that the dynamics underlying these short-term extreme events, both temperature and precipitation, are not well understood for most of the U.S. So we have, in some limited areas, some pretty good ideas, but broadly speaking, we don't have a great understanding of these, the dynamics underlying these events. Point 2, consequently, we don't have a great sense of how well the current climate models are able to capture these dynamics. Of course, any model will generate extremes. The question is whether they're generating the extremes for the right reason. And we don't have a detailed understanding of that, which imposes a fairly critical limit on our confidence in CMIP projections. Point 3, to that point, we found as a group that analyzing these large-scale meteorological patterns, the LSMPs, associated with these events is a very useful approach for getting at the dynamics, and additionally can provide a basis for downscaling. And then the 4th point is that I think in large part based on the success, the aims and the successes of the workshop, there's a lot of different pieces to understanding and predicting these extremes that require a lot of interaction between different communities. So extreme value statistics, observations, synoptic dynamics, modeling, and application. applications. So the workshop really focused on the first 4 areas, and there was a lot of interest in some sort of follow-on activity or activities that involved applications in a much more detailed way. So we, in the rest of this presentation, will be giving you some details and recommendations that summarize the whole working group, but then also there's considerably more detail in the workshop report, the climate variation special issue, and the one paper that's out and the other paper that's in progress. So I will just sort of start this recommendations overview and then hand it back to Richard. So the way these slides work is you can see there's, I think, 5 points on them, and then each slide sort of expands on one of those points into its subpoint. So again, there's a lot more detail in the reports and the papers. And I apologize for the sort of detail of the recommendations, but this the working group considered a lot of different subjects, so we have a lot of recommendations here. So the first one on data, and in terms of nomenclature, EWE is extreme weather event. So the recommendations in terms of data, number 1 was increase investment in big data infrastructure so that we can manage and process large amounts of model data and catalog the extreme weather events effectively. So you need daily or sub-daily data at a lot of different levels to really get at these events, which of course are very important to people. And managing the data, for instance, in the CMIP-5 or CMIP-6, upcoming CMIP-6, is currently very difficult. 2, better quantify and display uncertainties in the observed data sets. Even the observed data, of course, has limitations. 3, promote efforts to maintain current observing networks, including co-op networks, especially those with long records. So there's a lot of data issues trying to capture these short-term events, and maintaining and doing some data recovery and supporting co-op networks is very critical to having the kind of data that we need for this. And then finally, point 4, develop some sort of protocol or sets of protocols for comparing gridded data versus station data. Both because observationally there's need to use both, but then also because the models, of course, are gridded, not station data, and a lot of the observational analysis is station data based. So those are 4 recommendations based on data. And I think with that, I will turn it back over to Richard.
All right, thank you, Matt. And I noticed the comments that I talked too softly. Sorry about that. I'll try to talk a little louder. So Matt summarized the data ones. We have 3 general types of recommendations under statistical tools. Again, another bit of jargon here. EVS will stand for Extreme Value Statistics. We think it would be important to promote multiple ways in which one can find the LSMPs. So in that temperature extremes paper that just came out, we talk about 6 different ways, including one of which has not yet been applied to any meteorological data as far as we know. Each of these routines, and it's discussed at length in that paper, each of them has a set of pros and cons associated with them. And most of them are ones people are familiar with, like compositing, EOFs. Some people may be less familiar with, like clustering analyses and self-organizing maps. So that's what we mean by those kinds of analysis techniques. We'd like to develop and promote better prediction, better understanding of the uncertainty and reliability of various measures or metrics of LSMPs. And this would be particularly important for projections as well. And finally, we need to develop, and the EVS people are aware of this and are working on this sort of problem, better tools that include things that might be varying with time, such as trends that are present, also low frequency phenomenon, and their influences, as well as local surface factors and how these things vary seasonally. Under synoptics and dynamics, a number of people in the working group felt it was important to develop an objective, uniform, sort of simple tools for that. I think the reason was primarily so that they would be easily understood by people and not something where every person or every paper has a different way of doing something and then you're spending your time trying to figure that out instead of getting the knowledge. Blocking events have received lots of study over the years, so some of the tools that have been used for that we think can be applied to help understand the LSMPs. And while LSMPs are not necessarily something that persist for a long time, they do have a large-scale structure, a wave-like sort of pattern, similar to what blocking events have. We think it would be very important to fund developing simple and effective, concise metrics that relate to LSMPs. So there are some simple ones that are out there in the literature. We think those can be easily improved upon and can be a way in which you are assessing a climate model, a large-scale model's ability to create the environment in which the extreme develops. And it's not so sensitive to how well that model is handling things like the surface energy budget or some other local phenomenon that might be better handled, let's say, with a regional climate model. We'd like to fund engaging the atmospheric dynamics community into these studies more than has been in the past. We think there are two sort of general areas that are important there. One would be for deducing physical mechanisms responsible for the LSMPs, and then once you have that, then you can go look for those mechanisms in climate models. And as Matt mentioned, this is sort of the way of assessing whether you're getting it, the extreme correct for the correct reasons. And the other thing is the interactions between the LSMPs and the low-frequency modes. Now, I said earlier that these are distinct from each other, and the way we in the working group viewed the low-frequency phenomenon, and it might be a pattern like the PNA or the West Pacific pattern. It might be a lower frequency oceanic phenomenon like ENSO or PDO. We view those as creating an environment which is either more or less favorable for a given LSMP to create an extreme, and not something that creates the extreme in the first place. So we think that it would be quite useful to explore those linkages between those two. Under modeling, again, obvious acronym RCM for Regional Climate Model. As Matt mentioned, one of the things that's needed is better data and higher frequency and time. And then this has been a challenge that creates with big data manipulation and so forth, as well as visualization. We'd like to fund the dynamics and modeling communities to develop and apply analyses of the LSMPs as a way of identifying model biases, how the LSMPs occur, both in frequency and their duration, and any trends that might occur, not only historically but in the future. And this includes things as simple as better metrics for them, but also how their time evolution changes, both prior to the onset of an extreme event as well as through the duration of it. And there is some evidence now that more than one way can lead to the creation of an LSMP, so there's additional complexity there that I don't think the working group knew when we started. We'd like to fund developing better metrics that assess how good is good enough for an RCM to do a good simulation. And then finally, under other sort of category, we had some ideas for what might be good follow-on workshops. So one might be understanding the dynamics better and better LSMP metrics. So if you remember, the title of this working group was primarily to identify the circulation patterns, but understanding the dynamics is sort of the next step there. ETCCDI, if people don't know that, that's the expert team in climate change diagnostic indices, I believe. And so they work with a lot of surface data, but here we're talking about an atmospheric pattern and on a larger scale. There could be a workshop on application sector needs. US CLIVAR did something similar to that back in 2011, and there's more that could be done, perhaps, because I think there's somewhat of a disconnect still between the kinds of variables that modelers put out and the kinds of variables that someone in an application sector might need. For example, someone in agriculture might be interested in growing degree days or chilling hours or things like that, and those things require data at a relatively high time resolution and different than what is usually provided. Applied extreme value statistics and the predictability of extremes, those are things that we think would be useful as well to pursue. So this slide is here just to provide in one place a concise listing of our recommendations. And then this next slide extracts those recommendations that have something to do with a request for funding. So just briefly, investment in big data infrastructure. And we would add to that also, there was a concern we expressed in our working group report on maintaining the observing network with especially those stations that have a long time record. Anyways, other items listed there: funding metrics, funding atmospheric dynamics studies of the LSMPs and their links to low frequency modes, funding the analysis of model output and looking specifically for how the models are treating LSMPs and how LSMPs change over time in simulations, funding metrics and studies of how good the environment needs to be in order to have an adequate simulation regionally, and then maybe some support for follow-on workshops. In terms of existing programs, catching my breath here. Several ideas for research funding and workshops were presented above. And in addition to those, we're aware of some ongoing activities. We probably are not listing all of the ones that are here, but here are some that we thought of. First off, in US CLIVAR itself, as mentioned in the science plan, one of the 4 research challenges is extremes. And we know that there have been 3 working groups now that seem to cover the 4 topics there, or at least touch upon them. So there's been a tropical cyclone, there's been a drought working group, each of those, and of course now we have one on temperature and precipitation. So one question might be whether US CLIVAR wants to continue to visit these topics, maybe with a shift from identification to more on understanding, simulation, or even application of them to various sectors. International CLIVAR, they have a grand challenge. I think the title is given there as Science Underpinning the Prediction and Attribution of Extreme Events. I believe that's the title. I was asked to comment on their white paper that they produced as sort of a planning document for that. I'm not sure what expertise from this working group might already be on that panel that they're developing, but it would seem like a logical thing to bring at least some members of our working group on board there. Several members of the working group participated in the 3rd NCA. So I was a lead author in Chapter 6. I think Mike Wayner was a lead author in Chapter 2, and Sasha Gershanoff in Chapter 20. And there may have been others in the working group who contributed to the NCA. I can speak a little bit about what was in the agriculture chapter. In there, we did identify a number of uncertainties associated with extremes, and we think that some research effort and further work would be useful in that area. In terms of the International Union of Geodesy and Geophysics, they have meetings, they call them assemblies, once every 4 years, and then the associations like the International Association for Meteorology and Atmospheric Sciences have ones every 2 years. And I'm an officer in IAMAS, and at least since 2007, we've had sessions at these once every 2-year meetings that have to do with extremes. We usually bring together people from the forecasting community. For them, they call this high impact weather, and then we also bring in climate extreme people as well. For example, this summer there will be a meeting in Prague, and we have, I think, 72 presentations in the session that I'm a co-convener of, and then there are another 25 or so that are in other sessions that have to do with climate extremes. There's also the International Association of Hydrologic Sciences, and they have, at the same meeting, they have a joint session with a number of papers, I don't know how many, having to do with flooding. So there's quite a bit of activity internationally on this subject, and especially in places like Europe. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Matt, and he's going to finish out the slides that we have.
Thanks, Richard. There's also the NSF Prevents program, which I don't think we have a tremendous amount of knowledge of, but is another program that appears to be relevant. And then the last slide, I actually won't go through the very dense text of, but just to give you a flavor. At one point we were asked what a specific follow-on funding request might look like. So here's a possible specific project. Regional evaluations of how well current models capture the dynamics of these short-term precipitation and temperature extremes over the U.S. And just to give one concrete example, this is imagined to be something along the lines of the dry comp effort for those who are familiar with that, but rather than a setup with an effort focused on providing new model runs here, the setup would be providing a single data set that could be used to look at these the dynamics of these extreme events. So I'm happy to answer questions about this, but I'll just leave it as you can look at the details of this. But this is just an idea of what a possible project might look like in terms of regional evaluations over the U.S. of the dynamics of these extreme events. And then that might, of course, feed into the National Climate Assessment and the IPCC process and so on. So I believe that's all we have. Thank you very much for your attention. And I think we will take questions now. And I see, sorry, there's already a comment from Bill saying that we should also point out that the WCRP grant challenges are currently under review for a possible revision. So there's still room for input into the WCRP grant challenges. And then I see on the chat there's a question about StatMos and their activities, and I'll defer to Richard. I do not know StatMos.
I don't know anything about it either, I'm afraid.
Okay, so I don't, maybe Kristen is in control of this. I see Andrea has her hand raised.
Yes, she does. Her phone number is not linked with her name. So Andrea, if you could give me the last 4 digits of your phone number in chat, I will unmute your line.
And in the meantime, Fred has posted the link for StatMos.
Okay, Andrea, you're unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Richard and Matt, thanks so much for this presentation. Really interesting, and I just wanted to throw out that very interested in chatting with you and working with you on possible application sector needs. And I wanted to throw out a couple of things that are upcoming that might be a place to start connecting on that. One is that Greg Garfin, who I can't see who's on the call, so I'm not sure whether he's on or not. Greg and I are spinning up to look across CLIVAR efforts for the last several years for what's already been done that might be relevant for applications as science that we might start connecting to applications on. And I see a few things here, and I'd really like to brainstorm with the two of you and maybe some of the rest of the committee on this in the next several months. That conversation might aim us in a good direction for a workshop, but I also see it as separate, not necessarily having to have a workshop to do that. The other thing is we've submitted an AGU session to Public Affairs for AGU for this fall that's intended to be, AGU and AMS, that's intended to be what's the science coming out of CLIVAR that may be applications ready, or I'm not sure what the phrase would be, ready for the next step towards application. And I think there might be something really great here for that. One thing to know is that if it gets approved as a public affairs session, in the last couple of years you could submit an abstract both to the public affairs session and to some other session. So it doesn't necessarily limit where else you might be giving a talk. So those are the kinds of things that I'm thinking about and looking forward to talking to you more about this.
All right, that sounds great, Andrea. Thank you.
Great. It looks like Anish has a question. Anish, you are unmuted if you'd like to speak.
Okay. Hi, Richard, Matt. Thanks very much for the presentation. It was really informative. I had a question regarding your engagement with the modeling communities, like especially the regional modeling communities and also global modeling. You had said that you were looking for investment in big data infrastructure for storing and analyzing large data sets. But would you also be looking to engage with modeling centers on improving the representation of such extreme events or LSMPs and how they would change in projections? So
okay,
I guess,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think the answer is yes on that in terms of, we're looking for, we think we have a useful tool here by which one can do yet another form of assessment of model simulation. And, as Matt mentioned, it's the getting the extreme right for the right reasons. And so, yes, we are interested in that. I have a paper that I'm writing right now where we do something really simple with some LSMPs for California heat waves, and we just a simple analysis of how those are captured by 14 different climate models. So I think the answer is, that may be starting to ramp up. It may be one of the things that's a consequence of this working group and its focus on the LSMPs.
Yeah, I would just add to that. This is Matt. I agree with that entirely. I think one question at the sort of working group or US CLIVAR level is how to facilitate that interaction, how to make it easier. I definitely think there are a lot of folks involved who are very interested in that, and some, like Richard, are already working with folks, and others aren't. So one question is just how to sort of facilitate that interaction with modeling groups.
Okay. Yeah.
Or not necessarily a question for you, but just something to think about it. US sorry about that. Didn't mean to put you on the spot.
It's a good point, Matt.
But just at the US CLIVAR level is maybe how to facilitate that interaction, how to make it easier.
Yeah, so along those lines, in the NCAR community Earth system model, right? They have an annual meeting of all the groups, and then they have separate meetings of most of the groups, if not all of them, subgroups. So those are obvious opportunities that I've used to talk about LSMPs to the modeling community. I don't know that we have something similar to that for that many other modeling groups around the world. It tends to be at meetings and so forth, which is not a particularly efficient way of making that connection you're talking about.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Great. Thanks. Do we have any others on the line who have any questions for Richard or Matt? Please feel free to raise your hand or chat in the chat box. Okay, I don't see any hands. Matt and Richard, thank you for your time. Do you have anything else you want to add, or should we wrap up here?
I think we can wrap up. How about you, Matt?
No, sounds good to me. Thanks, everybody, and Richard and Kristen for organizing this.